Imagine this: you're sitting outside, on the porch of your home, cradling a warm cup of coffee in your hands. The steam rises gently, swirling in the cool morning air, and the sun peeks through the trees, casting soft golden rays across the lawn. The peaceful silence of the moment feels almost sacred, like a small escape from the chaos of everyday life. You take a deep breath, enjoying the tranquility. But then, suddenly, the calm is shattered by an unmistakable sound. A low, deep rumble. The ground beneath you seems to vibrate with each passing second. You squint into the distance and then freeze, your heart skipping a beat as you see it: a massive bulldozer, its metal tracks scraping against the gravel as it rolls towards your property. The machine's sharp, powerful engine roars to life, louder than any engine you've ever heard, and it's headed straight for your fence. Your heart starts to race. This can't be happening. Not today. But it is happening. The bulldozer comes closer, its huge metal arm swinging menacingly. And before you can even react, it smashes into the fence you've spent so much time building. The fence isn't just any fence. It's the one you designed and put together with your own hands. Every nail, every board, every piece of wood was placed by you, with sweat and effort. It's not just a barrier separating your yard from the rest of the world, it's a symbol of your hard work, your pride, and your personal touch on the space you call home. The bulldozer doesn't stop. It tears through the posts and beams as if they're nothing more than matchsticks. The sound of cracking wood echoes in your ears, the metallic screech of the machine filling the air. You feel a sickening sense of powerlessness. There's nothing you can do as it crushes and destroys what you worked so hard for. But just as the dust settles, you see her. Standing there, arms crossed, with a smug smile on her face: Linda Grayson, the president of your HOA. She doesn't even look concerned about the chaos unfolding around her. In fact, she looks almost pleased with herself. This is no accident. She's the one behind this destruction. As the bulldozer finally pulls away, you march over, your blood boiling with anger. "What is going on here?" you demand. Linda barely looks up from the clipboard she's holding, her eyes not meeting yours. "This is for the good of the neighborhood," she says dismissively, her tone as if she's explaining something obvious. But nothing about this is obvious. Nothing about this feels right. Your stomach churns as you realize that this isn't just a random act of destruction, this is personal. This is someone using their power to tear down what you've built. And if you don't fight back, it will be the beginning of a war you never signed up for. Chris Miller, a 35-year-old software engineer, lived a life that many could only dream of. He resided in the peaceful, picturesque neighborhood of Pinewood Oaks, a small, serene suburb far from the noise and chaos of the city. The neighborhood felt like a picture from a perfect storybook: quiet streets lined with trees, well-kept lawns, and houses nestled cozily in their own little corners of the world. It was a place where life moved at a slow, almost comforting pace, and for the most part, everyone lived in harmony. Chris had built his home from scratch, a labor of love that had taken him years to complete. It wasn't just a house, it was a project, a symbol of his hard work, determination, and dreams coming true. From the foundation to the roof, every inch of the house had his personal touch. He had carefully selected each brick, painted each wall, and meticulously worked on the smallest details. There was no contractor, Chris had done it all himself. Each morning, he'd wake up to a peaceful sunrise, brew a cup of coffee, and take a moment to soak in the tranquility of his surroundings. His backyard, which he had designed with just as much care and attention as the house, was his sanctuary. It wasn't just an ordinary garden, it was a place where he felt truly at peace with the world. The chirping of birds, the soft rustling of leaves in the wind, and the smell of fresh grass were the soundtrack to his mornings. And the pride of his backyard was the fence's sturdy, beautifully crafted barrier he had built with his own hands. This fence wasn't just a collection of wooden planks nailed together, it was a testament to his patience, his hard work, and his commitment to creating something lasting. Every morning, as Chris sipped his coffee, he'd look out at the fence, standing tall and strong, protecting his space. It was more than just a physical structure, it was a symbol of everything he had worked so hard for. Chris was proud of the home he had made, and the fence stood as a daily reminder of his accomplishments. It was a border that not only kept the outside world at bay but also gave him a sense of ownership, a sense of security. It was part of the dream he had worked toward for years. His life in Pinewood Oaks was simple, but it was exactly what he had always wanted. It felt like the perfect balance of hard work, reward, and peace. But everything changed on a seemingly ordinary morning. Chris had barely taken his first sip of coffee when it happened. The thunderous roar of a bulldozer's engine broke through the peaceful silence. At first, he thought it was just some construction noise from a nearby project, but the sound grew louder, and then he saw it. A massive bulldozer, its gigantic steel arm moving like a beast with a purpose, was rolling straight toward his property. Chris froze, his hand still holding the coffee cup. He squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The bulldozer was headed straight for his backyard, and the machine was moving directly toward the fence, the very fence that he had poured his blood, sweat, and tears into. Without thinking, Chris dropped the cup and rushed outside. His heart raced as he saw the bulldozer's large metal claw grab hold of his fence, ripping through the wood as if it were nothing more than paper. In the span of just a few moments, the fence, his pride and joy, the very thing he had built with his own two hands, was being destroyed. The sound of snapping wood filled the air as the bulldozer tore it apart, piece by piece. Chris couldn't believe what he was seeing. His feet felt like lead as he ran toward the machine. His mind was reeling, struggling to process the sight before him. He could feel his anger building as he neared the bulldozer, but more than anything, he felt a deep sense of helplessness. This wasn't just an accident. This was someone, or something, deliberately destroying the very thing he had worked so hard for. "Hey! Stop!" Chris shouted, his voice rising above the sound of the bulldozer. "What do you think you're doing?" But his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The machine didn't stop. It continued its relentless destruction, as though it was determined to tear everything down in its path. Chris's eyes scanned the scene, looking for any sign of who was behind this madness. And that's when he saw her standing off to the side, observing the destruction with an almost casual air. Linda Grayson, the president of the Homeowners Association, HOA, the very woman who had been behind the decision to tear down his fence. Linda stood there, a slight smile on her face, as though watching a job well done. "This is for the good of the community," she said, her voice cold and matter-of-fact, as if this were all perfectly justified. Chris's mind was reeling. He couldn't fathom what she was saying. For the good of the community? His fence was being destroyed in front of him, and she was acting like it was some sort of civic duty. Chris's pulse was racing. His chest tightened, and for a moment, he felt completely disoriented. He had never expected something like this to happen. He never imagined that someone could come onto his property and destroy something so personal, so important to him, without his permission. It felt like a violation, like everything he had worked for was being taken from him in the blink of an eye. "How can you do this?" he asked, his voice shaking with frustration and anger. But Linda didn't even look him in the eye. She simply nodded toward the bulldozer operator, who continued his work without a second thought. Chris stood there, feeling more isolated than ever. None of his neighbors were stepping in to stop it. They were all watching from a distance, some peeking out from behind their windows, others standing on their porches, but not one of them was saying anything. It was as if they were all too afraid to speak up, to challenge the power that Linda held over them. The silence was deafening, and it only fueled Chris's growing sense of betrayal. For the first time in his life, Chris felt utterly powerless. The very community he had once felt so connected to now felt distant and cold. His fence was being torn down, and no one was there to help. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was about something much bigger, a fight for his right to stand up for what was his. And it was just beginning. The sound of the bulldozer's engine echoed into the distance as it finally came to a halt. The destruction of his fence was done, but the damage to Chris's peace of mind had just begun. As he stood there, frozen in disbelief, he looked up and saw her, Linda Grayson, the president of the Homeowners Association, strolling toward him like she was walking on the red carpet at a high-profile event. She was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that screamed authority. Her steps were deliberate, almost calculated, and her posture was straight and proud. Her blonde hair, pulled back neatly into a tight bun, and her perfectly made-up face gave off an air of someone who not only expected respect but demanded it. There was something cold in the way she smiled, like she knew exactly what she was doing and how it would unfold. The smugness on her face made Chris feel like he was facing a corporate boss, not a neighbor. Linda stopped just a few feet away from Chris, hands planted firmly on her hips. She didn't even flinch when she saw the frustration and disbelief etched across his face. Her smile remained unshaken, as if she had just executed a well-thought-out plan that had worked to perfection. "This is for the benefit of the community," she said, her voice smooth, with the calm certainty of someone who had said this 1,000 times before. She spoke like she was delivering a simple fact, as if there was no room for debate, no possibility of objection. Chris blinked, his anger slowly boiling over. He could feel the heat rising in his chest. "What are you talking about?" His voice shook, not with fear, but with sheer confusion. "You're tearing down my fence." He gestured toward the demolished remnants of what had once been the pride of his yard, now reduced to jagged wood and splintered planks. Linda's smile didn't waver. She simply raised an eyebrow, as if his reaction was the least surprising thing in the world. "Your fence violates the neighborhood's new aesthetic guidelines," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "This is for the greater good of Pinewood Oaks." Chris's mind raced, trying to process her words. He opened his mouth to respond, but for a moment, he couldn't find the right words. Aesthetic guidelines. His fence. This wasn't about aesthetics, it was about something far more personal. His life's work. His pride. He had built that fence from the ground up. He had made sure every detail was perfect. And now, this woman was standing here, casually explaining away its destruction like it was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "Are you serious?" Chris finally managed to say, his voice low but thick with anger. "You're telling me my fence violates some guidelines?" He shook his head, unable to comprehend what he was hearing. "You come on my property and destroy something I built with my own hands, and you call it for the community. What kind of nonsense is this?" Linda's expression didn't falter. She remained cool, collected. If anything, her calmness only seemed to fuel Chris's anger. He was on the verge of shouting, but he held back, his fists clenching at his sides. "We've been working on this for months," she continued, her tone still dismissive. "We want Pinewood Oaks to maintain a certain look and feel. You might think your fence is nice, but it doesn't fit the new standards we've set for the neighborhood." Chris took a step forward, trying to control his shaking hands. "I never agreed to any of this," he said, his voice growing louder. "You didn't give me any notice about these new guidelines." He paused for a moment, his mind racing. How could I have possibly agreed to something I never even knew about? Linda tilted her head slightly, as if the whole situation was a minor inconvenience for her rather than an outright violation of Chris's rights. "Oh, you should have received the notice," she said, her tone suddenly turning almost condescending, like she was speaking to a child who didn't understand something simple. "But the rules are clear. Either you comply, or we enforce it." Chris stood there for a long moment, staring at Linda as her words echoed in his ears. Either you comply, or we enforce it? What did that even mean? He couldn't believe what he was hearing. This woman, this president of the HOA, was standing in front of him, casually dismissing his rights, his property, and his hard work. And it wasn't just her. It was the entire HOA, the group of people who were supposed to represent the best interests of the neighborhood. And here they were, imposing their will with a ruthless efficiency that left no room for debate. As Linda turned and began to walk away, her steps light and unbothered, Chris stood frozen in place, unable to process what had just happened. The bulldozer had already left, but the heavy weight of what had just taken place was still crushing him. He was alone in his backyard, surrounded by the wreckage of his work, and no one seemed to care. That night, after the sun had set and the chaos of the day had settled, Chris sat down at his desk, his mind still racing. He knew something wasn't right. The whole situation felt off, too sudden, too orchestrated. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that Linda's words didn't add up. If this was really for the community, why hadn't he been informed? He grabbed the subdivision agreement, a thick stack of paperwork that he'd signed when he moved into Pinewood Oaks. The terms and conditions were written in the kind of dense legal language that made it nearly impossible to understand without a lawyer, but Chris wasn't going to let that stop him. He spent hours flipping through the pages, scanning each line carefully, until bam, there it was. He found it. The moment everything clicked. His property wasn't even under the HOA's jurisdiction. The agreement clearly stated that the HOA's authority only extended to certain sections of Pinewood Oaks, but Chris's house was outside those boundaries. They had no legal right to touch his fence, let alone tear it down. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a violation. The HOA had overstepped its bounds. And worse, Linda knew it. Chris leaned back in his chair, staring at the agreement in front of him. His heart was pounding in his chest as he absorbed the full weight of the situation. He wasn't just dealing with a neighborly dispute or a misunderstanding of the rules. This was something much bigger. He had been wronged, and the HOA, led by Linda, had used their power to bully him into submission. It wasn't just about the fence anymore. It was about justice. It was about standing up for what was right, even if that meant taking on an entire organization that had tried to force its will on him. He knew he couldn't let this go. Chris wasn't just fighting for his fence, he was fighting for his dignity and for the right to protect what was his. Now, the real battle was about to begin. The question was no longer whether Linda and the HOA would back down, it was whether Chris could expose them for the power-grabbing bullies they truly were. And that was something they hadn't counted on. Chris couldn't let this injustice slide. After the devastation of his fence and the shocking confrontation with Linda, he knew he had to take action. The anger inside him burned hotter each day, and his desire for justice began to overshadow everything else. He had the legal documents. He had proof that the HOA had no authority over his property. Now, all he had to do was present it loudly and clearly at the next HOA meeting. The day of the meeting arrived, and Chris walked into the sterile, brightly lit conference room, papers in hand, ready to challenge Linda. As he stepped up to the front, he felt a surge of adrenaline, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was filled with familiar faces, the same neighbors who had silently complied with the HOA's demands for years, but no one spoke up. Everyone sat in the same stiff silence, as if awaiting Linda's word like a flock of obedient followers. Linda sat at the head of the table, her poised and confident expression barely hiding her smugness. When Chris walked in, she didn't even glance at the documents he was holding. She already knew what was coming and, in her mind, she had prepared for it. Chris started with the basics. "I've got the subdivision agreement here," he said, raising the papers high enough for everyone to see. "The HOA has no authority over my property, so I want my fence reinstated." He paused, scanning the room to gauge reactions. No one spoke up. Linda, unfazed by his bold declaration, leaned back in her chair and gave him an almost bored look. "Well, "Didn't you get the memo?" she asked, a smug smile forming on her lips. "We amended the bylaws. It's all in there." Her voice was sharp, almost rehearsed, as if she had anticipated this challenge. Chris's stomach churned with frustration. He clenched his fists, trying to keep his composure. "No, I didn't get the memo," he shot back, his voice rising. "And even if you did amend the bylaws, you can't just tear down my fence without any notice. That's not how this works." The other board members remained silent, their eyes shifting between Linda and Chris, but no one dared to intervene. Chris could feel the walls closing in around him. It was clear, Linda wasn't backing down. And the more he tried to reason with her, the more she seemed to relish in her power over him. This wasn't just about offense, it was about control, and she wasn't going to relinquish it easily. Determined to fight back, Chris knew he needed more than just legal documents. He needed proof of Linda's wrongdoing. That night, he called his friend Sarah, a sharp-witted paralegal with an uncanny ability to dig up hidden truths. Together, they dove into the HOA's records, sorting through years of old files and bylaw amendments. It didn't take long for them to uncover something explosive. Linda hadn't just amended the bylaws, she had forged signatures to push them through. The amendments had been passed without proper consent from the residents, and the whole process had been a sham. But that wasn't all. As they dug deeper, they uncovered a financial trail that was even more damning. Money from the HOA funds had been funneled into a private account under Linda's name, money that was supposed to be used for neighborhood improvements. The fraud was undeniable, and it was clear that Linda had been lining her pockets at the expense of the very people she claimed to serve. Chris's blood ran cold as he stared at the evidence. It was worse than he had imagined. He had suspected corruption, but this went far beyond a simple power grab. It was theft, plain and simple. And now he had the proof to take her down. Armed with the evidence of Linda's fraud, Chris wasn't about to sit back and let her get away with it. He began knocking on doors, visiting his neighbors one by one. Some of them were afraid to speak out, too intimidated by Linda's power, too fearful of the consequences. But a few of his neighbors listened, their eyes widening as he revealed the truth. "We've all been fooled," Chris said quietly, his voice tinged with urgency. "Linda has been lying to us, manipulating the HOA for her own gain. She forged documents and even took money from the HOA's funds. We can't let her get away with this. We have to fight back." Some of his neighbors nodded in agreement, their faces set with determination. Together, they filed formal complaints with the local authorities and the neighborhood's legal advisors. It wasn't a large group, but it was enough, a small but mighty band of residents who were tired of Linda's manipulation. They knew that standing up to her wouldn't be easy, but they had the truth on their side, and that made all the difference. Linda wasn't going to let this go quietly. A week after Chris had started rallying his neighbors, he received a formal letter from the HOA, a cease and desist order, demanding that he stop creating unrest in the community. Along with the letter was a hefty fine for violating community peace. It was Linda's attempt to intimidate him into silence. She thought that a fine and a legal threat would scare him, but it only fueled Chris's resolve to fight back even harder. Chris wasn't the type to back down in the face of adversity. He installed a security camera on his property, facing the street and the area where the bulldozer had previously torn down his fence. He knew Linda wouldn't stop trying to push him around, and he needed to be ready to capture any further illegal activity. It wasn't long before Chris's decision to install the camera paid off. One night, as he sat in his living room, reviewing some documents, his phone buzzed. It was an alert from the security camera. When he checked the live feed, his heart sank. 2 HOA workers were dumping debris onto his front lawn. They were dragging piles of broken wood and old construction materials and dumping them just feet from where his fence had once stood. Chris immediately recorded the footage, feeling a rush of adrenaline. This was it, the evidence he needed to expose Linda's corruption once and for all. He quickly uploaded the video to the neighborhood forum, not knowing what to expect. Within hours, the response was overwhelming. Neighbors who had previously been too afraid to speak out were now coming forward, rallying behind Chris. People who had lived in Pinewood Oaks for years began to express their outrage, and the tide of support shifted in his favor. The video went viral within the community. The once feared Linda was no longer the unchallenged authority she had been. The truth was out, and her days of control were numbered. The video exposed Linda's dirty tactics in front of everyone. It was a turning point for the neighborhood. People who had lived in Pinewood Oaks for years, who had quietly tolerated Linda's reign of fear, suddenly felt empowered to stand up. They weren't just going to sit back and let one person dictate their lives anymore. Chris had started a revolution, one that was bigger than just his fence. It was about reclaiming the community, about standing up to corruption and the misuse of power. Linda's carefully crafted empire of lies was crumbling before her eyes. The once feared HOA president, who had manipulated and controlled Pinewood Oaks for so long, was now being exposed for the fraud and deceit she was. The anger from the residents was palpable, and it was clear that Linda had underestimated the strength of the community she thought she controlled. The day of the court hearing arrived, and Chris stood alongside his lawyer, Maria, feeling a sense of determination he hadn't felt in months. Linda, her lawyer, and several members of the HOA board sat across from them, all looking confident and self-assured. But Maria wasn't intimidated by their presence. She had the truth on her side, and that was all that mattered. Maria presented the case with precision and clarity. She laid out the evidence of Linda's forgery, the illegal funneling of HOA funds into a private account, and the violation of Chris's property rights when they destroyed his fence. She even presented emails where Linda openly admitted to trying to assert dominance over Chris in order to intimidate him. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation, and Linda's smug expression began to fade as the weight of the evidence settled in. Chris's heart raced as he listened to the judge's ruling. The judge's decision came swiftly and decisively. Linda was found guilty of embezzlement, document falsification, and the illegal destruction of Chris's fence. The HOA was ordered to pay Chris $20,000 in damages for the destruction of his property and the emotional distress he had endured. But that wasn't all. Linda was referred for a criminal investigation, and the once powerful HOA president was now facing charges that would ruin her career and perhaps her freedom. For Chris, it was the moment he had been waiting for. He had won, not just for himself, but for the entire neighborhood that had been oppressed by Linda's rule. Her reign of fear had ended, and justice had. With Linda removed from power, Pinewood Oaks began to heal. The HOA held a special election, and for the first time in years, a new president was chosen, someone who promised transparency and fairness. Chris didn't just get his fence back. He helped restore justice and inspired his entire community to stand up for what was right. As Chris sat back in his backyard, watching the sunset, he realized that his fight wasn't just about a fence. It was about standing up for what you believe in, even when it feels like the world is against you. His fence wasn't just a barrier, it was a symbol. A symbol of justice, resilience, and the power of truth. Thanks for watching this incredible story. If you want more real-life drama, family conflicts, and ethical dilemmas, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join us at the Unravel. We've got more stories that'll make you think twice about the world around you. See you next time.